As I said outside, welcome along, ladies and gentlemen, to the 5th Biennial Keating Memorial Lecture and the 4th Dean's Lecture for 2022. One of the great things about being the Dean is you get to have Dean's Lectures, and it's great that we're back face to face and enjoying the opportunity to have a drink and socialise again. Not everyone can be here tonight, and we, as I've said before, there are a lot of people who did apologise, and some late sort of apologies through a couple of COVID instances and things. So we are filming this, and we do get an enormous amount of hits for our Dean's Lectures. So it's not just us that we're here talking to tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge any Indigenous people with us here tonight. So tonight's Dean's Lecture is, of course, something that we've all been looking forward to, and we've been blessed by having Professor Leesa Wheelahan come back to her home, and it's great to have you back with us, Leesa. Really brilliant. Not in my time, so my first meeting again, but really welcome you here. But before we do that, I do want to talk about Jack Keating more formally than I did outside. And I'd like the opportunity, again, to welcome Jack's family, who I've introduced to you already. So it's great to have you here, and certainly in my 5 years, you've been great supporters of MGSE, and I know Jack would be really pleased about that. For those who may not be as familiar with Jack's work, he was an inspirational educator, mentor and researcher, highly regarded and respected in the global education community, an influential scholar and policy advisor, a caring friend to all, and a champion for the disadvantaged, a loving and dedicated husband and father. Professor Keating was a specialist in post-compulsory education and training, most noted for his contribution to education policy and debates. His work combined formal roles in advising departments of education around Australia and organisations such as the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority and the Victorian Registration and Qualifications Authority. Professor Keating also contributed to research and scholarship on the international stage, including the work for the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the International Labour Organisation, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development and UNESCO. His substantial contributions to education policy in Australia and abroad reflect his passion and lifelong commitment to democracy and equity in education. Right up until his passing on the 21st of July 2012, Professor Keating played a crucial role in guiding MGSE's work on post-secondary education and training, vocational education, school funding and senior secondary curriculum and pathways. These lectures honour the life of Professor Jack Keating, his vast contribution to education, the graduate school and countless educational other organisations and communities around the world. Jack's legacy also lives on in the Jack Keating Fund, which was established in 2012, which Kwong reminded me today that he also contributes to, and it's in his memory to commemorate his contribution to education policy and research. And Russell Cross will talk a little bit more about that at the end of the session tonight. So I do welcome everyone here, the friends and colleagues and people that have known Jack in their life. It is a great celebration, and we've got a great opportunity to celebrate through Leesa tonight. So let me talk a little bit about Leesa. It does give me great pleasure to introduce you formally, Leesa, and welcome along to MGSE tonight. Welcome also to Leesa's family, son Lachlan Dorney, who... There you are, Lachlan. And also Jamie and Jenny, welcome along as well. It's great to have you all here. Leesa's a professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, where she holds the William G. Davis Chair in Community College Leadership. She was previously an Associate Professor in Adult and Vocational Education at the University of Melbourne and is a well-known researcher in vocational education, education pathways, tertiary education policy, and the nature of and purpose of qualifications. Professor Wheelahan's research has a number of strands that are all underpinned by concern for social justice in access to and the outcomes of education. Her research focuses on the role of theoretical knowledge in qualifications, pathways between the sectors of tertiary education and between tertiary education and the labour market, relations between colleges and universities and the tertiary education policy. Current research includes educational and labour market pathways, baccalaureate degrees in colleges, and marketisation and privatisation in vocational education and the college sector. Professor Wheelahan also worked with Jack Keating when she was an Associate Professor here at the University of Melbourne and was fortunate to call Jack her friend. With that, would you please welcome Leesa to the lectern. Present the Jack Keating Memorial Lecture titled The Purpose of Qualifications and Do Micro-Credentials Matter? Thanks, Leesa.
Thanks. Well, it's a pleasure to be back here. I think I've spoken in this hall more than once, and it's lovely to see so many friends here once again. I just got to make sure I get the clicking right. Ah, yes, perfect. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which we are meeting tonight. We meet here in the land in which I was born and raised, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I wish to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people who are the custodians of this land as they have been for millennia. I would also like to pay my respects to elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous people here tonight. I also want to talk about my current home. I now live and work on Turtle Island, which is where I've done much of the work about which I'll be speaking tonight. And Turtle Island is the name used by some Indigenous peoples to designate Canada and the United States. The name is based on a common North American Indigenous creation story and in some cultures is synonymous with North America. Specifically, I work at the University of Toronto, which is on land which has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I need to acknowledge that I work on the land of these people. Today it is the meeting place and home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. I want to say a little bit about Jack, of course. I think this is all our favourite photo of Jack. It's a lovely photo. And there are many people here tonight who account Jack Keating as a friend, a mentor and a colleague, and me included. And I worked with Jack directly here when I was an associate professor, and I think he may have even had the title of my boss for a while. But we've been friends and colleagues for a lot longer. I miss him, and he's had a huge influence on my life and on my work. And in addition to his intellectual leadership, Jack just made opportunities happen for people, including me, and I'm very grateful for that. And many of us are here tonight because Jack helped us along the way. I want to acknowledge Jack's family, Linnell, his daughter Bon, and Jack's sister. Thank you very much for this invitation to come tonight. And I also want to acknowledge Jack's many friends and colleagues who are here tonight. Finally, I want to thank the University of Melbourne for this invitation, because this is one of the great honours of my life, to be asked to do this lecture. And I'm a bit nervous for that reason. Okay, so my starting point tonight is a conference paper by Jack that he presented at 2008 in Monash University that should be more widely known. Thank God for VocEd. So VocEd is the database that's managed by the National Centre for Vocational Education Research, and it's the best in the world, and it's a gift to all of us. I use it as the starting point for many of my PhD students in Canada, and VocEd preserves many resources that would otherwise be lost, or lost in the ether, and they welcome suggestions. And this paper by Jack is on VocEd, and it deserves to be widely known, read and used. So Jack is perhaps best known for his work over the decades in researching and influencing policy in the school sector, both in Victoria and nationally, but also through his work in the Gonski Review and the many things that we've heard about tonight. But his work goes beyond that, and it goes beyond shaping the school sector and the vocational education sector to also including higher education through his work on the Australian Qualifications Framework. I want to use this insight from Jack about the nature of qualifications, and his work on qualifications has helped shape my understanding and has been important in recent work that we've done with Gavin Moody in thinking about micro-credentials, and with Gavin and Jamie Dorney, who's here tonight, on a recent paper where we critique the skills fetish. Tonight I'm using Jack's work as a starting point, but also to extend and develop our thinking, and so these are new thoughts, which is always a bit scary and a bit dangerous, but I do welcome feedback on that, because we are testing out these ideas and trying to think a bit more about the role of qualifications. I also want to acknowledge Gavin Moody's involvement in planning this presentation tonight. So Jack defines a qualification in this way: he says a qualification is the formal act of the award of a qualification. He says the formal act of the award of a qualification is that of recognition of the learning. Recognition is a form of validation that the learning has been achieved. He says this begs the question of what learning, and the what learning is the important part of it, and I'll be exploring that in this presentation. So we regulate qualifications because they matter, and in most countries, the titles of qualifications, for example, degree and the award of qualifications are regulated. And this is because of the key role that qualifications play in mediating all aspects of our lives, particularly but not just our working lives. Micro-credentials, which I'll be defining a little bit later in more detail, such as badges, digital certificates, are a pressure point in the whole notion around the regulation of qualifications. And this is one reason, because we do regulate qualifications, because they do matter, and this is one reason why there's so much policy attention in many jurisdictions on how to incorporate them in qualifications frameworks. So qualifications are the response to the question, what do we want graduates to know and be able to do? And Jack's insight is that there's no clear answer to this because the social settlement is under pressure. I would say the social settlement is fractured. He argues that qualifications are the outcome of contested social settlements between powerful social constituencies. He says the relative composition and power of constituencies differs between the schools, vocational education and higher education sectors. Schools, and particularly private schools, have powerful elites to protect their interests, as do the universities, as after all they train the social elites. But the outcomes are always a compromise and always under pressure. Vocational education doesn't have powerful constituencies in the same way as schools and universities, and it's the sector that's acted upon by powerful interests, particularly, most recently, employer peak bodies. Under Labor governments, these interests tend to be more corporate and include unions. So the social settlement is a compromise over what matters and why, but this social settlement in each sector is under pressure. On the one hand, we have the culture wars in curriculum, and on the other we have the jobs focus, and under the last government, the egregious efforts to dissuade students from doing useless arts degrees because they putatively don't lead to good jobs. Increasingly, the social settlement has narrowed to the development of human capital as the principal purpose of education in all sectors. So the argument tonight is that qualifications in all sectors need to foster human flourishing and not just knowledge and skills needed for work. A subsidiary argument is that micro-credentials don't do that. So the key question that I leave you with is what kind of credentials. I slip into North American lingo a bit here occasionally, I'm very sorry. Credentials is the word that's used in North America to refer to qualifications. So that's just an explanation. The key question is what kind of credentials are required to prepare people for work, citizenship and life. So here's how I'm going to develop this presentation. The first section I'm going to look at forms of tertiary education, Martin Trow's elite mass and universal higher education. Then I'm going to look at theories of tertiary education. Then I'm going to come back to Jack's work and look at roles of qualifications, and I'm trying to put them together, and that's the new bit, right? And that's the bit where we need frank and fearless feedback in thinking about this. Then I'm going to look at micro-credentials, and I'll define this a bit later, but I need to clear the ground first on what qualifications are before turning to what micro-credentials are not. And then finally, what kind of qualifications do we need? So here's the conceptual framing that I'm using tonight. So I'm using Trow's theories of elite, mass and universal higher education, and then look at theories of tertiary education, institutional theories, the schooled society, theories of human capital, and then finally credentialism. And each of these theories is embedded in a body of theory that goes some way to explaining stuff, but not far enough, in my view. Then come back to Jack's stuff on roles of qualifications, cultural, employment and social. I don't want to present this as a tight conceptual framing just something useful for thinking about the evolution of our system and the theories that explain it, and how we think about qualifications. And I hope to demonstrate that we need a broader conception because our current tools aren't good enough. So, forms of tertiary education. So, in writing in 1973, Martin Trowell, who is famous for this work, in an extraordinary and prescient analysis, argued that societies, particularly in the wealthy West, but progressively around the world, were on the path from going from elite to mass to universal systems of higher education. He was writing about higher education, but he included in that associate degrees offered by community colleges, which are analogous to diplomas and advanced diplomas in Australia, sort of. And in Ontario, where we have diplomas and advanced diplomas in my home province in Canada. So Trowell argued that an elite system is one in which less than 16% of the relevant age cohort go to higher education / tertiary education. It is a privilege afforded principally to elites and is one way in which the privileges of the elites are socially reproduced. A mass system, he said, is one in which between 16 to 50% of the population goes to higher education and participation incurs an advantage. It is a principal means of social mobility. A universal system is one in which 50% or more of the population go to higher education and participation is expected, and not participating incurs a disadvantage, unlike previous types of systems. When he revisited his work in 2005, he'd previously posited it as stages of development of higher education, but he realised actually that when the mass system emerged after World War II, the elite system didn't go away, and when the universal system emerged in the 60s and 70s, the mass and universal components persisted. So it's best to think of this as forms of tertiary education within a universal system, one that has elite and mass components, and that institutions generally reflect their origins as institutions that emerged in the elite, mass and universal periods. TAFE and the post-1988 universities in Australia are arguably institutions more typical of the universal component. They are more vocationally focused with less privileged access, and they prepare people for a broader range of roles. It's also possible to think of this typology in thinking of forms of provision even within institutions. So so medicine and law are elite everywhere, wherever they're offered, even if they're offered in institutions which are not elite. So the purpose of an elite system, which persists to today, is to prepare the social elite. And the role of curriculum is to shape the mind and character of students. It's highly structured academic knowledge and professional knowledge with strong boundaries between the institution and society, and its role is to train future leaders in elite roles for governments and learned professions. A mass system where 16 to 50% of the population go to higher education or tertiary education prepares a segment of the population for a broader range of technical and economic leadership roles. The curriculum is more modular, semi-structured, and there's fuzzy boundaries between the institutions and society. A mass system trains experts for a broader range of still quite elite occupations, and particularly the technical and economic roles that emerged after World War II, when we had the massive expansion in professional roles up until the 1960s and the 1970s. And participation in the mass system did provide, not so much now, but did provide a means for social mobility for a much bigger percentage of the population. And this is when the technical and the vocational begins its ascendancy over the liberal and general forms of education, particularly after World War II, because it did provide a form of social mobility for a bigger segment of the population. He argued that a universal system is one in which 50% or more of the population go to tertiary education, and the role is to prepare the whole population for rapid social and technological change in advanced industrial society, and the boundaries between theoretical knowledge and professional knowledge and everyday knowledge break down, as do the boundaries between the institution and society. Now, the key point about Trowell is he wasn't talking about human capital here, right? He was talking about, he wasn't talking about external imperatives. He wasn't talking about a curriculum that was tightly tied to vocational preparation. He was talking about preparing people to respond to rapid social, technological, cultural and economic change quickly, things like pandemics. Now, the penalty for exclusion in universal systems are worse than in elite systems, because at least when a smaller segment of the population had access to higher education, there were many jobs available to those who didn't have it. And not having a qualification did not preclude you from broader participation in society in the way it does today. Well, are we there yet? Well, it's clear that around the world we have trajectory towards what another ex-Melbourne University academic, Simon Marginson, has argued, towards a high participation system where the gross tertiary enrolment rate of the relevant age cohort is over 50%. And most rich countries have achieved this, and many mid-income countries are on the way, as are many low-income countries. According to the OECD, Australia has very high levels of participation for the relevant cohorts. So 50% of 20-year-olds are enrolled in tertiary education, so diploma or above. And another 20% are enrolled in lower levels of education. We also have very high levels of tertiary education attainment, as you can see here. So I think we can say that we are certainly in a universal system. Now, in a high participation system where everyone's got to go to post-secondary education, education distributes access to various positions in the social hierarchy and has done so since World War II. It's the main path to social mobility. But at the same time as this has happened, systems have become more hierarchical and stratified as they have grown, and they are resources of class. And resources of class and power matter, particularly in providing privileged access to the elite sections of the system. So that hasn't changed. The focus in a high participation system becomes social inclusion, making sure people are included. And if they aren't, the question is, what's wrong with them? Why aren't they included? Rather than a concern with social justice or distributive justice. The focus isn't so much on the types of participation and the fact that different types of higher education result in different types of outcomes. And in countries like Australia, a degree is more important than ever. And so I agree with Simon. This growth to a high participation system is inevitable and inexorable. So who gets access to what? What are the implications for society and for democracy when half the population has access to post-secondary education qualifications and the other half don't, necessarily? Or what about those who've gone before them and haven't had that access? What does that mean for a society? And how do types of access matter, given that access to different types of qualifications mediates different types of imagined futures? Well, now I move to theories of higher education to explore this. There's three dominant approaches that I'm going to look at. The first is human capital theory and subsequent development of skill-biased technological change. The second are institutional theories, or theories of the schooled society. And the third are credentialist theories, both Weberian and Marxist theories. Now, in the first group of theories, human capital theory, skill-biased technological change, and institutional theory, it's all good. Tout va bien. So the current orthodoxy in education, which has been for the past 50 years, is human capital theory, in which more education leads to more skills, which leads to better productivity and a higher GDP. There's a direct linear connection between all these elements, and this applies at the level of the individual, the group, the sector, the economy. There's one approach for everything, and that is human capital. It also applies to equity. The problem of equity is underrepresentation in tertiary education, which leads to underuse or underdevelopment of human capital, which is a dreadful way of looking at it, but nonetheless that's how it's understood. But the problem was that this theory doesn't work. The links between education and jobs are very weak, and it doesn't account for the differential outcomes by class, gender, race, or other relations of domination and social inequality. It did seem able to describe the impact of education up until the 1970s, until the end of the long post-war II economic boom, where there was a massive growth in jobs, particularly in white-collar jobs, but it's less able to explain changes since that time and the different returns that are experienced by different sections of the population. Now, the failure of human capital theory led to its questioning and problematising, and then its modification in skill-biased technological change, which, I mean, they argue with each other, but it's, I think, a variety of the same thing. And in skill-biased technological change, the arrow of causation is reversed. So rather than education driving demand, it's technological change that drives demand for more skilled or educated labour. According to this approach, the problem is quality of education, and years of educational attainment, which is normally how the stock of human capital is measured, is too blunt an instrument because of the huge variation between countries. Therefore, we need to directly measure skills. PISA, PIA, TIMSS, all of these things are a result of that. And it also explains the focus on 21st century skills. The problem is that we don't teach the right skills, and we need to get the mix right. Now, in the 1960s, so human capital theory has been around for a long time, but it starts to rise to dominance in the 1960s and the 1970s, and it's evolved over the last 50, 60 years. In the 1960s and the 1970s, human capital theory was descriptive. It explained why individuals, firms and nations invested in higher levels of education. In the 1980s and 1990s, human capital theory becomes normative. Education should be about work. And in the 2000s to now, it's become prescriptive. Education must be about work, and funding policies in many countries are trying to tie education much closer to the labour market and not just the vocational education sector. So higher education is under similar pressure here in Australia and in Ontario, where the Conservative government is seeking to tie 60% of public funding to outcomes, 60%, with a particular focus on labour market outcomes. And there are many examples from many countries. Well, how's all that going? Well, when in doubt, double down. The theory doesn't describe society or education, change society and education to fit the theory. Well, here's the figures from the Australian vocational education sector, which shows you that the outcomes for vocational education graduates, all graduates, not just publicly funded, who got a job in the same occupation as their training course was 25%, with a further 26.5% employed in a different occupation but found the training relevant. And this varies by occupational group, with the highest matches between the regulated trades and qualifications, and then between qualifications that are a bit more regulated, like nursing, aged care, childcare, that sort of thing. So about half. Now, remember, in Australia, in vocational education, we have a tight model of competency-based qualifications. Qualifications are directly linked to jobs, and units of competency directly tied to workplace tasks, roles, responsibilities and requirements. And there's been lots of tinkering over the years to respond to criticism, but the model is still fundamentally unchanged. But overall, the links between qualifications in both sectors and jobs are very weak, except in regulated occupations. So you can't be a lawyer without a law degree or a nurse without a nursing degree. The links between, paradoxically, the links between qualifications and jobs are better for higher education than they are for vocational education, because employers tend to use the level of the qualification rather than the content of the qualification as a proxy for skills, ability and attributes. And the higher the skill level, the better the fit if the criteria of relevance to the job is used. Well, now I want to move to institutional theories, or theories of the schooled society, which argue that the inexorable transformation of society is happening with education as the key driver in this process. And in some arguments, it is the key process. They argue that the educational revolution is at the centre of the transformation of post-industrial society, and that educational credentialing becomes ever more legitimate. A key theorist in this school, David Baker, argues that education is the key driver in this social transformation. He says more so than forces from outside the institution itself, such as the economy and labour market demand. They argue that there's 4 institutional processes which are shaping, by which educational credentialing is deeply integrated into the occupational structure and hence society. The first is belief in equality of opportunity as social justice rises. The second is belief in the development of modern individuals as a collective good. The third is belief in the dominance of academic intelligence, and the fourth is belief that a diversity of academic degrees is synonymous with a diversity of specialised knowledge and education. Right, now I'm going to go to the theories where tout est mauvais, it's all bad. Weberian credentialist theories and Marxist and neo-Marxist credentialist theories. The first is Weberian credentialist theories, which puts education, like the school society or institutionalist theories, puts education at the centre of the social order. And this group includes theorists who draw from the tradition of Max Weber, a German sociologist and regarded as one of the founding fathers of sociology in the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century. And these are the two very, very famous texts in this tradition. They argue that literacy and numeracy matters and not much else. Teach them to read and write and then you're right. And that they argue that there's not much relation between skills and education. They argue that credentials are a mechanism for competing status groups to ensure and maintain social closure, particularly the professions. The implication is that most people get more education than they need, and that this leads to overskilling, overeducation, credential creep, and the educational arms race. Now, this approach shares with institutional theory the belief that education is at the centre of the new social order, but in a way that fundamentally reproduces inequality and social closure rather than seeks to ameliorate it. They've got a few things going for them. They talk about the sheepskin effect. Now, the sheepskin effect means that those who have a credential earn more than those who have virtually the same amount of education in the same area but lack the credential. And sheepskin is because that was the vellum on which the testament used to be written. So if people learnt stuff of value, then it wouldn't matter if they had the qualification. If they were missing that one unit, it wouldn't matter if they had the qualification or not. And this shows that the credential is key and not learning. They do have an important insight. David Bills, in talking about the educational arms race, talks about how positionality and the proliferation of diplomas transforms the social definition of those who lack them, so penalty for exclusion. He says, with educational expansion, high school dropout becomes a stigmatised and despised category, even when the productive potential of these people is unchanged. He says, thus, positionality, at least in this admittedly very specific historical context, works to the benefit of those whose credentials have become congested. So you're in an educational arms race. Education as a positional good is more likely in countries with weak vocational education systems, and he says where individuals have an incentive to acquire high levels of education to stay ahead in the labour queue. Positionality through education becomes a fundamental feature of contemporary social stratification. So I move now to Marxist credentialist theories, which argue that education is the key mechanism for reproducing class society and social inequalities, and the advent of mass and universal schooling and now tertiary education was to produce a working class with sensibilities for mass production. And we can see this a lot in the employability skills, that governments tout, that emphasise having the attribute that bosses find desirable, all playing for the one team, which is the firm or the enterprise, no problems of power there, and other relations of solidarity, for example, being a member of a union, aren't included. The game is rigged. And Bowles and Ginter's, the Bowles and Ginter's book is the most famous book in this tradition. They also argue that overskilling and overeducation exists, and that the problem is that the skills held by those in low status jobs aren't recognised, so feminised occupations and things like that. Now, the problem for me with both Weberian and Marxist theories is that they both implicitly accept the human capital argument. Education is meant to be the gateway to good jobs, and it isn't, so education fails in those terms. They don't really posit an alternative vision of what education can do or evaluate the ambiguities. Not all Marxists do this, of course. I mean, particularly the Gramscian tradition is much better on this, but so this is very broad brush. Now, they all have a point, even though they disagree with each other. They all have a point. Human capital theory, education does augment society's productive capacities, even if it does it in unequal ways. Institutional theory, education is contributing to transforming society. Weberian credentialism, education does enable social closure for professions and elites. Marxist credentialism, education is a key mechanism for reproducing class and other inequalities. But how do we take the insights of each to understand what qualifications are, how they function in society, and most importantly, what the problems are with them? And what should we do with this, most importantly? I don't think any of them tell the whole story. So now I want to move back to Jack's work on the roles of qualifications. Jack argued that qualifications both influence the practices of education and training and act as currency for the outcomes of the learning. He said that there are three different traditions, writing in 2008. He said there was and that there's tensions between these traditions. He said there's the human capital tradition, which has an occupational or an industry focus, and curriculum is derived empirically from work, but often but not always expressed as competencies. Then he says there's the cultural tradition, which is based on abstract sequenced knowledge, or the disciplines, the academic disciplines, which provides access to knowledge and citizenship. Its cultural purposes are that these qualifications are located dually in the passing on and development of the disciplines and in the broader social purpose associated with social structures and interactions and beliefs and understandings, including citizenship. And then he posits a third, which arguably started to become prominent in the 1990s, the pathways or lifelong learning tradition, which emphasises social inclusion. And he says here the emphasis is generalist, and because people need to be included, they need to be found a place, and the emphasis on links between standardised qualifications and pathways, and strong links between education and social and economic participation and inclusion. I would argue that this third one is now subsumed in the first one. Social inclusion is supported through access to human capital. He argues that each type of tradition provides access to a different form of knowledge and capacity to participate in society's debates and controversies about what it should be like. He argues that there's tensions between these different approaches, but nonetheless there's coherence within them because there are coherent internal relations within them. He says, whatever we may think of that. So the tensions between, particularly the human capital and the cultural traditions, he said the key tension is that they provide a different kind of access to knowledge and envisage a different notion of the citizen. He said, but all lead to the central issue of knowledge and learning, including their role in the educated system. He argued that they have a relational quality. The human capital tradition, relational qualities around workplace practices or the occupation, that's what gives it its coherence. And in the cultural tradition is drawn from knowledge structures. He says the case is that knowledge needs to be relational. Knowledge needs to be relational for epistemological reasons, ontological reasons, and for pedagogical reasons. And he says that the relational aspects of knowledge have been the historical driver of the growth of knowledge and the core of a qualification in its intrinsic form. He argues that bite-sized chunks of learning, the word micro-credentials wasn't around then, he argued that bite-sized chunks of learning have no dynamic capacity, which is the essence of the educated and skilled person, and will be meaningless in a workplace environment. And micro-credentials are not relational. Micro-credentials are alternative credentials which are substantive enough to count towards a full qualification, usually understood about 6 months. More or less, that seems to be the emerging consensus. And they can be made up of smaller components, digital badges, micro-courses and micro-certifications that are built from the bottom up. You add it all up. So the total is the sum of the parts, not more than the sum of the parts. There are extravagant claims made for the potential of micro-credentials, just as they were for MOOCs. Deakin, for example, has to talk about not being rooted in any occupational identity or context, at Deakin you can do micro-credentials in critical thinking, collaboration, innovation, digital marketing outside of an occupation. At RMIT, cultural intelligence, emotional intelligence and stuff like that. There's also stuff that's more substantive. And there are lots of skill sets in vocational education which are meant to be around a particular job role. So in our work, we've argued that micro-credentials atomise and fragment knowledge and skills. They're small, they can be taken in any order or any combination or stand alone, and they make development of sustained knowledge and skills based on cumulative hierarchical coherence difficult. And arguably, they contribute to the fragmentation of jobs. For example, in producing window framers and not carpenters, coders and not IT all-rounders. Now, the rationale for micro-credentials is that they are market relevant, they produce graduates who are job ready, bite-sized chunks that can be stackable, they're shovel ready, you know, and that people need to constantly update in order to stay ahead of the game. It's what industry wants. So the argument is that we have better integration with employers. It's a skill-biased technological change on steroids. It's able to personalise and recognise professional learning putatively, and putatively can respond to the changing needs of the workplace by allowing individuals to upskill when and how they need to, and it is claimed probably for lower cost. Now, the rationale for micro-credentials, as for every other innovation that's driven by human capital theory, is democracy, social inclusion, self-realisation. Who can be against that? All access through private for-profit entities like YouTube and the Khan Academy. And the argument for micro-credentials continues. Individuals are free to choose what they will learn, how, when, and in what ways. So self-realisation, but self-realisation of human capital for a very narrow purpose. They will putatively provide disadvantaged students with access to cheaper learning as they build towards a full credential, and that this can contribute to widening access for hitherto excluded groups. That's the argument. They can respond to changing needs of the workplace by allowing individuals to upskill when and how they need to, and it's claimed cheaper. Indeed, the language of empowerment, self-regulated learning and learner autonomy, personalisation, intrinsic self-motivation and self-realisation are associated with micro-credentials in exactly the same way as they were associated with MOOCs in 2012. But the outcomes are not great, and I'll come back to this. In our work, we argue that micro-credentials are a response to precariousness in the labour market, as more and more people now are in precarious forms of employment. Micro-credentials shift the focus of investing in human capital from the enterprise to the individual. They result in a lot of cost shifting. In precarious labour markets, individuals take on greater risk in the labour market. They've got to second guess what's going to be required in the labour market. They've got to hit the ground running. And this is in the absence of any substantive social welfare net. Education is now the safety net, which individuals have to self-finance in many ways. And they must make sound investments. And if they don't, it's because of the decisions they have made. Now, this slide shows you participation in formal and non-formal learning at different points in time, for those aged 15 to 74. It shows a bit of a bump in 2022 when we had a few more people participating in non-formal learning, but overall the trajectory for people involved in formal and non-formal learning is down and has been going down for decades, and it has been accompanied by systematic disinvestment by employers in their own internal training. They expect people to come ready, say for example with Microsoft credentials or whatever. But interestingly, overall, the higher the level of the qualification, substantive qualification that the person has, the more likely they are to participate in non-formal learning, and the more likely it is to be workplace learning. So again, we see the Matthew principle: to those who have, more shall be given. Individuals pay to break into or upgrade their position in the labour market or demonstrate that they are indispensable in order to survive a spill and fill. And as I said, they expect individuals to be already changed. Okay, so what is the problem for policy? I think we need to be careful of the assumption that just because non-traditional learners will have trouble completing degrees or diplomas, that the alternative is micro-credentials. We need to think beyond this default setting that because X, in this case diplomas or degrees, is hard, therefore the only option is Y, in this case micro-credentials, without properly interrogating whether micro-credentials are helpful or not. The evidence actually is that outcomes from micro-credentials are weak. In Australia, the vocational education sector has long offered micro-credentials in the form of skill sets, which are groups of competency that have putatively been organised around work roles in coherent ways. But the outcomes for graduates, unless they've already got a credential, a qualification, is very poor. And in the US, researchers at the New America Foundation have found overall weak positive gains for those with micro-credentials. So those with micro-credentials may be somewhat more likely to get jobs, but not very good ones, and with pay that's not very good without great prospects. So this is not a path to social mobility or social inclusion. So in societies where there is mass and near universal participation in higher education, students need access to a meaningful qualification or credential that has value in society and in the labour market. There is no way around this. The problem for policy is not how many students can we get through micro-credentials. It is rather, how can we support students to gain credentials or qualifications that have value and position them to undertake meaningful work and participate in society as citizens, parents and political persons. Access to and successful attainment of qualifications is a necessary precondition to fully participate in society as a citizen and a worker. It is the passport to the lifestyle associated with culture and well-being. It is a hard policy problem, but it can't be evaded. We've had this problem with every expansion of every level of education, from universal primary school to universal secondary school and now to universal tertiary education. So I want to try and bring this all together, and I want to revisit the conceptual framework that I posed at the beginning. So we can see that each of these groups of theories explored here tonight explains some aspects of tertiary education, the different forms it takes, elite, mass or universal, and the roles that qualifications can play, but they're not the whole story. In a universal system, the dominant policy driver is human capital theory because education is tied tightly to the labour market in a market society rather than a society supported by a market. But this is entwined with the discourse of democracy and social inclusion, defined as access to human capital. However, experience has shown that while having human capital is a necessary condition for participation in the labour market at a level commensurate with one's qualification, that it isn't enough. And not everyone who has human capital is able to use it. This is an anemic and one-sided view of the purposes of education, but credentialism is now an essential feature of society. Those in the elite and mass components of the system are still able to accrue an advantage, but not always. And this helps to explain middle-class anxiety about education as a positional good and ensuring one's kids go to the right schools and get into the right universities and the right professions. For those in the universal component, access to education is an essential defensive mechanism with enormous penalties for non-completion. So on that cheery note, what kinds of qualifications are required to prepare people for citizenship and life? Now, Basil Bernstein, a British sociologist of education, argued that education and the rules that are used to evaluate education or forms of assessment shape and distribute forms of consciousness, identity and desire. That's because they shape the possible and the different imagined selves. A focus on a democratic and inclusive society and not just the creation of human capital requires a more expansive view of the value of qualifications and the role they play in society. We argue that qualifications should have intrinsic value, and as Jack explains, this means intrinsic value refers to personal benefit and status that a qualification gives to the learner, the platform and motivation it gives for further learning, and the wider social value of an educated citizenry. They should also have use value, exchange values, social value and educational value, which often gets left off. Most focus and most theories is on use value and exchange value. And sometimes there's an emphasis on social value. For example, institutional theories emphasise positive social value, whereas credentialists emphasise the negative social aspects. But not many incorporate all five, and we should do so. So the theories that I outlined earlier do not address these forms of value. Human capital focuses on value and exchange value, whereas institutionalist theory does focus more on social value. Credentialist theories miss intrinsic value and social value. They focus only on use value and exchange value, and note that the promise is not delivered. The theories, for the most part, don't focus on intrinsic value, social value and educational value, and all these dimensions are needed to support human flourishing. A focus on these dimensions, we argue, provides us a way with thinking about the relationship between the individual and society and the knowledge they need to participate in society. Reinserting educational value allows us to explore what is distinctive about education that can't be got from any other social realm. So this is the final slide. What are the role of qualifications and how do qualifications support these values? So we argue that the role of qualifications should be threefold, recognising that not all qualifications will do it in the same way and to the same extent, but nonetheless that these three roles should be present to some extent. First, educational, to develop graduates and society's understanding of theoretical abstract knowledge, because this is the language that we use to think about what our society should be like and to think beyond our day-to-day experiences, to have insight into the lives of others and other imagined futures. Second, occupational, to develop graduates' individual and work groups' collective productive capacity in society. And third, social, to advance society, social justice and social inclusion. So, thank you very much.
That was just fantastic. And it was so powerful and such a powerful acknowledgement of Jack's work and the legacy of his work to start with that paper on qualifications and then to build on that. But importantly, you've given us the knowledge, the conceptual knowledge, for us to think through the challenges that we're facing in how we think about what is the purpose of the education that we're offering at this university, but also in terms of the work we do with other sectors. And to have that knowledge is just so important to enable us to really think through what do the different qualifications mean, what purpose should they serve, and how can education be something that is enabling and not just reconstituting power structures. So this has been enormously important, and I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank you for the body of work that you've produced, because this work you're doing now is a culmination of a lifetime of fantastic work, which is really important because, well, for one thing, you've given attention to vocational education, described as the forgotten middle child of education. And therefore, as you said, the area which doesn't have power and where ideas are tested out. And so, I mean, many of you are interested in vocational education, but if you're not, pay attention to it, because the forms of marketisation that Leesa spoke about have been well tried and tested in that space. So you give us the foundations to think through the major challenges that we are facing, and this is what your body of work does. And it's also work that has the intellectual rigour, it has the foundation in theory, but it looks to policy and the messiness of the political process. And you've always been very clear on the risks of how ideas and narratives will be recontextualised in ways that can be quite troubling. But you still go there. You still go into this messy space and you help shape the narratives around vocational education, but also tertiary education more broadly. And so I want to thank you for that. Also, underpinning this work is such a strong commitment to social justice and to imagining education as something that is not narrow, that is not instrumental, is not atomised, and is not something that will just ensure that the elites continue with their positions and the rest will have little. But you really help us envision something that is much more powerful. So I think we all need to thank you for that. Most of you read Leesa's work, but I want to draw attention to one important thing about some of the most recent papers, and they're available through open access. And this is also important because it means the audience is well beyond the academy. And probably the quickest way to access them is through your website, Leesa's University of Toronto website, and you'll see lovely little links that go straight to those papers. So Leesa, I can't thank you enough for your presentation tonight, for your body of work, for being the most wonderful colleague one could have, and thank you.
Thanks.
Leesa.